Every now and then, a gem is found within the huge pile of games on Steam. Such a product is usually, but not always, created by an indie studio, features an extremely fun gameplay loop, or given a rare badge of honor, overwhelmingly positive reviews. Severed Steel is one of those gems that ticks all three boxes. In case you're not aware, I enjoy fast-paced action games and I tend to look for them on Steam every now and then, so it was only a matter of time before I came across Severed Steel. Although the store page only had a short trailer to showcase its gameplay, it was more than enough to convince me, or rather the past more bored version of me who really craved the new experience. So it shouldn't come as a surprise when I say that I've been enthralled by the game ever since. And I suppose I was very lucky on the day I found it. So what is Severed Steel and why do I enjoy it so much? For starters, it is a single-player bullet time shooter with enhanced mobility. Okay, it doesn't sound like much without further elaboration, so I'll split the game into 4 parts. Movement, combat, style, and aesthetics. Of course, there will be a demonstration at the end where I'll put all of it together and showcase my skills. Alright, let's begin with movement. When it comes to movement, the player character Steel has a very high movement speed and access to a bunch of options that Titanfall players only wish they had. When traversing the map, Steel can kick, double jump, wall run, slide, and dive. All 4 of these abilities not only provide more options for level traversal, but they also provide opportunities for skill expression. For example, the kick can be used directly on enemies to stun them, but players can also kick objects into enemies. Alternatively, kicking a wall or airborne enemy would provide the player with an extra jump. Double jump and wall running are the least interesting abilities because they are exactly that and nothing more. There is one oddity that I've noticed though, and that is unlike a game like Titanfall, Severed Steel allows players to wall run on the same wall repeatedly without touching the ground or any other surface, which means that players can scale extremely high walls without much restriction. Sliding allows the player to squeeze through small gaps in the level geometry, but also comes with a hitbox that deals damage and knocks enemies back. Doing it in mid-air pushes the player downward, which allows for split-second adjustments. The dive ability allows the player to move in a set direction and go over shorter obstacles, but they are stuck in this position, which means that by default, a dive cannot be chained into other movement abilities such as a slide or wall run. A dive can be quickly cancelled by pressing the slide button when touching the ground instead of waiting for it to finish, which returns the player to a standing position. The best part about diving is that it removes the usual 180-degree restriction on vertical mouse movement, which means that the player can turn upside down while in a dive. This provides so many opportunities for player expression, so it's no surprise that this is my favorite movement ability in the game. While performing any of these abilities, the player is given invincibility frames for as long as they are in that state, meaning that players are heavily encouraged to do it as often as possible to prevent a quick death. But of course, movement isn't the only thing that this game does well. The combat is a core feature of this game, so let's go over it. Severed Steel's combat system is interesting not because of its complexity or difficulty, but because it ties in so well with the other parts of the game. The combat in this game is simple and not very difficult, even though it can be extremely fast-paced at times. This is because the game allows players to slow down time whenever they want in order to adjust their movement and aim. Usually, players will find a weapon and cut their way through enemies, replacing their weapon whenever necessary. When ammo eventually runs out, another weapon must be obtained. Throwing an empty weapon at an enemy before picking up a new one is generally a good idea, even though it can actually be done at any time after picking it up. By this point, you're probably wondering why I'm making it sound like players cannot reload in this game, and that's because there is no reloading in this game. The title of this game is Severed Steel, and it just so happens that Steel is missing her left arm. Fortunately, she must have also followed in the footsteps of the engineer from TF2, as she also replaces her lost arm with a superior weapon built for destruction. It's a cannon. She gets a cannon. Unfortunately, players can only hold 3 charges at a time, but can collect extra charges from fallen enemies. To compensate, the cannon can one-shot most enemies on direct hits or blow them away if the shot misses. It can also cause explosions and blow holes in the level geometry. That's right, this game features completely destructible environments. Using the cannon, players can easily create new opportunities and pathways by blowing holes into walls and ceilings. Some enemies are given flamethrowers too, which can somehow melt everything around them. This can gradually make the level more dangerous to traverse, but it also provides more angles for the player to shoot them from. Overall, destructible environments were implemented quite well, thanks to the game's environments being comprised of voxels. I will get back to these voxels later. For now, let's move on to the stylish aspects of the game. The movement and combat can tie well into each other, but players have to be incentivized to make the most of it. After all, in many cases, one has to appeal to a human's self-interest to get them to do something very specific. In this case, give them points. Introducing the style meter. Lots of action games have this, so I was not surprised to find it here. For those who aren't familiar, points are granted for certain actions like headshots or killing an enemy while sliding. The number of stylish actions can be chained together to increase the combo multiplier, which further increases the points awarded to the player. More points are awarded for new actions, so players are incentivized to mix them up every now and then. After all, it would be boring to only shoot enemies while diving, for example. Thanks to the aforementioned invincibility frames as well as the style meter, players are incentivized to not only perform these movement abilities whenever possible, but also to use as many of them during a level to get a higher score. Coincidentally, this feels great to play. In fact, this is one of the only games where I found myself attempting the same levels repeatedly, even over 100 times, just to get a perfect run. I only ever did the same thing in the past with the Dishonored games. That goes to show how high the skill ceiling can be, and I'm not even close. Just as it feels great to play, this game feels great to look at as well. Most of the environments consist of flat colors and don't have a lot of detail to them thanks to their destructible nature. Most of the heavy lifting is done through colors, contrast and lighting, which work together to give the game a distinct style. In some cases, the levels can look a bit liminal too, which I really appreciate. Whenever an objective is given, huge words will appear on the screen one by one. Obviously, this is a nod to a rather different but similarly great bullet time shooter, Super Hot. When it comes to gameplay, it is often the little things that when done well add up to enhance the whole experience. For example, when the player gets a kill in a stylish way, the game would throw numbers into the air and a pulse would spread out from the target and highlight the environment. When the player does something cool, an arcadey sound would play and the style meter would go up. This provides the player with great feedback and reinforces the power fantasy that the game provides. Movement, combat, style, and aesthetics are the four pillars that hold this game up. When put together, an experience that cannot be fully put into words presents itself. You just have to feel it. As you can see, the gameplay loop of Severed Steel can be very fun and almost addicting. Aside from the main campaign, the game features two alternative modes, the first one being Firefight, which challenges players to rack up a high score in a variety of levels. Many of these are from the campaign, where the usual objectives are removed, as players are only required to kill all the enemies in a level. The second alternate mode is a roguelite, which consists of 10 levels by default. After each level is completed, the player gets to choose from a selection of cards that provide either new abilities or greater challenges. Choosing to make the run more difficult comes with more rewards, usually in the form of a larger score multiplier. Some of these modifiers force players to adapt to its changes by limiting their options. For example, enemies with heavy armor can spawn more often, those with jetpacks can be immune to bullets, or every weapon comes without ammo and can only be thrown. All of these, as well as fun modifiers like big heads and paintball, can also be applied to firefight levels, which gives them more replayability. Finally, we have user-generated content. Yes, there is a level editor in this game, and when I play a game with a level editor or photo mode, the actual game tends to become an accessory to me. There is a wide selection of levels in the community workshop. The sheer variety of levels that are present due to the relatively large number of creators provides the game with replayability beyond the game's own firefight mode. But not all is well, as no matter how great a game may seem, I cannot give it a perfect score. Even as I praise Severed Steel, there are a few things that I must criticize. So here are a few things that the game could have done better. First off, the game's story mode is lackluster. There is barely any story at all, at least from what I could infer, although one could argue that telling a story wasn't a priority for the developers. As for the level editor, it's mostly great as it provides the same tools that the developers use themselves. Enemy spawns and objectives can be set and customized, and the intended length of time spent on a level can be changed by having more objectives or enemies. Even with prior experience with level editors in Halo and Doom 2016, I still found it to be difficult and time-consuming to learn, especially when it comes to making objectives work. The wording used in the options can also lead to some confusion and further complicate the design process. The level editor also does not work if I rebind any of the controls. This means that if I want to move my camera, add and edit voxels and place objects and enemies, I have to reset my controls to the default configuration. I don't know why it is like this, and I think it's unforgivable enough to count as a downside in my eyes. Finally, the enemies in this game are a bit too aggressive with their firing patterns. Most shooter games have groups of enemies that shoot in bursts with low to medium accuracy so that the player has time to locate them and react accordingly. This is to prevent players from being gunned down by numerically superior foes with flawless accuracy the moment line of sight is achieved. Severed Steel does not follow this trend. Every enemy will shoot at the player in full auto with near pinpoint accuracy. This is to encourage the use of their movement abilities, which is unnecessary because the scoring system is incentive enough. Unfortunately, this forces players to use their abilities constantly instead of whenever they feel like it, which reduces the number of viable playstyles that players can adopt. On the audio side of things, the sound effects for weapons are unfortunately hit or miss. Suppressed weapons are extremely soft to the point of not being satisfying to shoot, and some weapons such as the auto shotguns have extremely high-pitched sound effects which are painful to listen to without slowing down time. The enemies also tend to shout a lot for some reason. The playtesters must have found them annoying as well, for they have their own volume slider. I played the game for about an hour before I decided that I couldn't stand it anymore and adjusted it to 0. For your sake, I'd suggest doing the same, that is if you do end up picking up this game. And speaking of trying it out, I'd highly recommend it to anyone who enjoys fast-paced action games. Even if it may not be anywhere close to your favorite games, I'd recommend you give it a try. Who knows, you may end up liking it as much as I do.